March 19th, 1943. Philippine Sea. 03:47 hours. The water was black glass beneath a moonless sky. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto stood on the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Ikazuchi, hands gripping the cold metal railing as his eyes strained against the darkness. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, thick with the humidity that never left these tropical waters. Behind him, the convoy stretched across 5 miles of ocean. 12 merchant vessels carrying rubber, oil, and rice from the conquered territories to feed the Empire's war machine. Protecting them were 4 destroyers, their crews alert but confident. These were the seas Japan controlled, waters they had dominated since Pearl Harbor. The Americans were broken, their Pacific fleet scattered. Their submarines, those few that dared venture into Japanese-controlled waters, were clumsy, ineffective weapons operated by men still learning the bitter lessons of modern naval warfare. Hashimoto had read the intelligence assessments. American submarines were plagued by faulty torpedoes that failed to detonate or ran too deep beneath their targets. Their commanders were cautious, bound by peacetime regulations that valued preservation over aggression. The Japanese Navy had coined a dismissive term for them, Hikoki no Nai Kokubokan, aircraft carriers without planes. Big, slow, defenseless targets that could be hunted down by destroyers with little effort. In 18 months of war, American submarines had accomplished nothing that would alter the strategic balance. They were a nuisance, not a threat. The first explosion came at 03:49 hours, a geyser of white water erupting amidships on the tanker Osei Maru, 500 meters to starboard. The sound reached Hashimoto 2 seconds later, a deep, visceral boom that he felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. Before he could process what had happened, a second explosion tore through the cargo ship Taiei Maru directly ahead, splitting her hull and sending a column of flame climbing into the night sky. Then a third, a fourth. The convoy dissolved into chaos, ships turning in panic, their wakes crossing in the darkness as captains attempted evasive maneuvers against an enemy they could not see. Hashimoto screamed orders. The Ikazuchi came about, charging toward the estimated attack position, depth charges ready. But there was nothing there. No periscope wake, no telltale oil slick or air bubbles. The sea had swallowed the predator without leaving a trace. Around him, 3 merchant ships were already listing, taking on water, their crews abandoning ship into lifeboats that bobbed like toys on the dark swells. And somewhere beneath those black waters, unseen and unheard, an American submarine was reloading its torpedo tubes and selecting its next target. In the span of 7 minutes, Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto's understanding of submarine warfare and Japan's command of the Pacific had been shattered as completely as the hulls of the ships now sinking around him. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the submarine had never been more than a supporting weapon, a tool for scouting and harassing enemy warships, not a decisive instrument of maritime commerce warfare. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized attacks on military vessels, battleships, carriers, cruisers, with little consideration for the merchant shipping that sustained those fleets. This philosophy was rooted in the samurai tradition that prized direct confrontation between warriors, not the unglamorous work of strangling an enemy's supply lines. Japanese submarines were large, complex vessels designed to operate with the fleet, providing reconnaissance and launching attacks on high-value targets during decisive surface engagements. The concept of unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping, the strategy that had nearly brought Britain to its knees in World War I, was considered dishonorable beneath the dignity of the Imperial Navy. American submarine doctrine had evolved differently. The United States had entered World War II with 51 submarines in the Pacific Fleet and a clear, if untested, strategy: wage unrestricted warfare against Japanese merchant shipping, cut the supply lines between Japan's home islands and the resource-rich territories it had conquered in Southeast Asia, starve the empire of the oil, rubber, metals, and food that sustained its military ambitions. The strategy was sound, but in the first 18 months of the Pacific War, American submarines had struggled to execute it. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of the submarine fleet, was plagued by fundamental design flaws. Its magnetic influence exploder often detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all. Its contact exploder was too fragile, breaking on impact rather than triggering the warhead. Its depth-keeping mechanism ran 10 to 15 feet deeper than set, causing torpedoes to pass harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. Submarine commanders filed report after report describing perfect attacks that resulted in no damage. They documented torpedoes that struck enemy ships broadside and failed to explode. They watched through periscopes as their weapons ran true, struck home, and accomplished nothing. The Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development, refused to acknowledge the problems, insisting that the failures were due to crew error or improper attack procedures. Submarine skippers who persisted in reporting torpedo malfunctions found their fitness reports questioned and their complaints dismissed. The disconnect between the weapon's theoretical performance and its actual combat effectiveness created a crisis of confidence that nearly crippled the American submarine campaign before it truly began. The Japanese Navy observed these failures and drew conclusions that would prove catastrophic. American submarines were ineffective because American submariners lacked skill and aggressiveness. The few merchant ships that had been sunk were statistical anomalies, not indicators of a growing threat. Japanese naval architects continued designing merchant vessels without adequate defensive armament or convoy discipline. Destroyer crews trained for surface engagements and carrier escorts, not the patient, technical work of anti-submarine warfare. The Empire's merchant marine expanded to support operations across the Pacific, confident that American submarines posed no significant danger to the maritime supply network that was Japan's lifeline. By March 1943, that confidence was about to be systematically destroyed. The transformation began not with technological breakthroughs or tactical innovations, but with bureaucratic persistence and scientific rigor. Submarine commanders like Dudley "Mush" Morton, Sam Dealey, and Richard O'Kane refused to accept the official explanations for torpedo failures. They conducted unauthorized tests, firing torpedoes against cliffs at point-blank range and recovering duds to examine the damage. They shared information through informal networks, comparing notes on attack angles, depth settings, and failure modes. They documented every malfunction with meticulous detail until the evidence became impossible to ignore. In June 1943, the Navy finally acknowledged that the Mark 14's magnetic exploder was unreliable and authorized its deactivation. In September, after more tests and more failures, they admitted that the contact exploder was faulty and redesigned it. By late 1943, American submarines were finally equipped with torpedoes that worked as designed. The impact on Japanese merchant shipping was immediate and devastating. Commander Morton's Wahoo had already demonstrated what aggressive submarine tactics could accomplish. In January 1943, during a single patrol, Wahoo penetrated into the heavily defended waters of Wewak Harbor, New Guinea, and sank 4 Japanese ships in a daylight surface attack that violated every principle of cautious submarine warfare. Morton's approach was revolutionary. Treat the submarine not as a fragile vessel to be preserved, but as a hunter to be unleashed. Surface whenever possible to gain speed. Attack during daylight when targets were visible. Fire multiple torpedoes in spreads to guarantee hits. Close to point-blank range if necessary. Accept risk in exchange for results. Morton's patrols read like adventure novels. In March 1943, Wahoo sank 9 ships, totaling over 20,000 tons in a single patrol. In April, another 5 ships. Morton's crew painted Japanese flags on their conning tower for each kill, a visible scoreboard that inspired other submarine commanders to adopt similarly aggressive tactics. The submarine force began to share successful approaches, developing a culture of innovation and calculated risk-taking that stood in stark contrast to the cautious, by-the-book approach of the war's early months. The Wahoo represented not just successful attacks, but a philosophical transformation. American submariners had learned to hunt with the predatory efficiency their boats were designed for, but which doctrine and defective weapons had prevented. The USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, would take these lessons even further. O'Kane had served as executive officer under Morton aboard Wahoo and absorbed his mentor's aggressive philosophy. When O'Kane took command of Tang in October 1943, he brought Morton's tactics and added his own innovations. Tang would become the most successful American submarine of the war, sinking 33 ships totaling over 100,000 tons in 5 patrols. O'Kane perfected the night surface attack, using the submarine's low silhouette and superior surface speed to close with convoys, strike multiple targets, and escape before escorts could react. He developed the down-the-throat shot, firing torpedoes directly at approaching destroyers to force them to turn away, buying time for Tang to dive and evade. But it was the cumulative weight of the entire submarine force, not individual aces, that strangled Japan's maritime empire. The Mark 14 torpedo, once fixed, became the symbol of American submarine effectiveness, a weapon that represented both the industrial capacity to correct mistakes and the willingness to acknowledge and solve technical problems. Each torpedo was 18 feet long, weighed 3,000 pounds, and carried a 600-pound warhead that could break a merchant ship's back or hole a warship below the waterline. Submarines carried 24 torpedoes, 16 in the tubes and reloads, 8 in reserve. A single submarine on a successful patrol could sink 6 to 8 ships, removing thousands of tons of cargo from Japan's supply network. The sound of a Mark 14 leaving its tube became the signature of American undersea warfare. A sharp pneumatic hiss followed by the whirring of the torpedo's propellers as it accelerated to 46 knots, running straight and true toward its target. Japanese sailors learned to fear that sound, though most who heard it had only seconds to react before the warhead struck home. Unlike German U-boats in the Atlantic, which often attacked surfaced and used their deck guns to conserve torpedoes, American submarines in the Pacific relied almost exclusively on torpedo attacks. The vast distances of the Pacific made gun actions impractical, and the availability of torpedoes, backed by American industrial production, meant submarines rarely had to conserve ammunition. By late 1943, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. In 1942, Japan had lost approximately 1.5 million tons of merchant shipping to all causes. In 1943, that figure doubled to over 3 million tons, with submarines accounting for the majority of losses. In 1944, submarines would sink over 4 million tons, crippling Japan's ability to import the raw materials its war economy required. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies to Japan fell by 70%. Rubber imports collapsed. Food shipments from Manchuria and Southeast Asia became irregular and unreliable. The Empire's industrial production began to falter not because Allied bombing destroyed factories, but because submarines destroyed the ships carrying the coal, iron, and oil those factories needed to operate. Japanese destroyers and escort vessels struggled to counter the submarine threat. Anti-submarine warfare required specialized equipment, sonar, depth charges, coordinated convoy tactics that the Imperial Navy had neglected to develop during its pre-war expansion. Japanese depth charges were less powerful than American or British models, and Japanese sonar was technically inferior and operated by crews with limited training. The few escort carriers Japan possessed were spread thin across the Pacific, unable to provide air cover for the hundreds of convoys moving between occupied territories and the home islands. Submarine commanders learned that Japanese convoys often lacked adequate escorts, that their zigzag patterns were predictable, and that Japanese anti-submarine tactics were reactive rather than systematic. Commander Eugene Fluckey, captain of USS Barb, would later describe the experience of hunting in Japanese waters. "We operated in an environment where the enemy's merchant fleet was increasingly undefended. Convoys that should have had 4 or 5 escorts would have 1 or 2. Merchant captains, desperate to make their delivery schedules, would sail without escorts at all. We could position ourselves along known shipping routes and simply wait for targets to arrive. It was not heroism, it was execution of a strategy that the enemy had no effective counter for. The human cost of this submarine campaign fell heaviest on Japanese merchant sailors, men who had never trained for war but found themselves on the front lines of a conflict that showed no mercy. Japanese merchant vessels were slow, averaging 10 to 12 knots, making them easy targets. They lacked the watertight compartmentation of military vessels, meaning a single torpedo hit could sink a merchant ship in minutes. Lifeboats and rafts were often inadequate, and the vast distances of the Pacific meant rescue was unlikely for survivors. Thousands of Japanese sailors died not in quick explosions, but in the slower horror of exposure, dehydration, and drowning as they drifted in empty ocean with no hope of rescue. The Imperial Navy's failure to protect its merchant fleet stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of modern industrial warfare. Japan had prepared to fight a decisive battle, a single climactic engagement that would destroy the American fleet and force a negotiated peace. The concept of attrition warfare, of slowly bleeding an enemy through thousands of small engagements that cumulatively destroyed their capacity to fight, was alien to Japanese strategic thinking. By the time Japanese naval leadership recognized the existential threat posed by American submarines, the resources needed to counter them, destroyer escorts, anti-submarine aircraft, convoy system infrastructure, could not be produced in sufficient quantities. Japan's industrial capacity, stretched thin supporting operations from the Central Pacific to Burma, could not match American production rates. In 1943, American shipyards produced 140 new submarines. Japanese shipyards produced 37. American factories manufactured 15,000 Mark 14 torpedoes. Japanese production of comparable weapons barely exceeded 3,000, and many of those were allocated to surface ships and aircraft rather than submarines. The arithmetic of industrial warfare was rendering its verdict. Japan could not replace what America destroyed faster than America could destroy what Japan produced. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of the few Japanese destroyer captains to survive the war, wrote in his memoir, "We fought submarines with tools designed for surface warfare. Our depth charges were too weak, our sonar too primitive, our tactics too rigid. American submarines operated with a freedom we could not counter. They struck where we were weakest, avoided our strengths, and gradually strangled our empire by cutting the maritime arteries that sustained it. We had destroyers that could sink submarines, but we could not be everywhere at once, and the Americans learned to be where we were not. By mid-1944, American submarines had begun to penetrate even into the Sea of Japan itself, the body of water between Japan and Korea that Japanese planners had considered absolutely secure. Operation Barney, conducted in June 1945, saw 9 submarines successfully navigate through the heavily mined Tsushima Strait and conduct a coordinated campaign in waters the Japanese considered their inner defensive perimeter. In 12 days, those 9 submarines sank 27 ships, creating panic and further disrupting the already crippled flow of supplies to Japan's home islands. The USS Flasher, under Commander Reuben Whittaker, epitomized the systematic efficiency of American submarine operations by 1944. Flasher would end the war as one of the top 3 most successful American submarines by tonnage sunk, destroying over 100,000 tons of Japanese shipping across 5 patrols. Whittaker's approach was methodical rather than flamboyant. He studied Japanese convoy routes, analyzed patrol patterns, and positioned Flasher to intercept targets with minimal risk. His patrol reports read like ledgers of destruction. 3 tankers sunk, 2 cargo ships damaged, 1 escort vessel destroyed. The clinical precision of these reports masked the human and strategic consequences. Each tanker represented thousands of barrels of oil that would never reach Japanese refineries. Each cargo ship carried rubber or metals that would never be transformed into aircraft or munitions. What made Flasher and submarines like her so devastating was not individual brilliance, but systematic application of doctrine refined through 3 years of combat experience. By 1944, American submarine tactics had been codified, taught at submarine school in New London, Connecticut, and disseminated through the fleet. Captains learned to exploit the superior range and endurance of American submarines, which could patrol for 60 to 75 days, compared to the 30 to 45-day endurance of Japanese submarines. They learned to use radio intelligence, breaking Japanese codes to identify convoy routes and schedules. They learned to coordinate wolf pack attacks, with 2 or 3 submarines operating together to overwhelm convoy defenses. The Japanese Navy never developed an adequate counter to these tactics. Individual destroyer captains became skilled submarine hunters, men like Commander Teraoka Tomiji, whose destroyer Amatsukaze sank the submarine USS Amberjack and damaged several others. But individual skill could not compensate for systemic inadequacy. Japan needed hundreds of escort vessels operating in coordinated convoy systems with air support and comprehensive anti-submarine training. What they had were a few dozen destroyers spread across an ocean, operating with outdated equipment and insufficient coordination. The gap between requirement and capability widened throughout 1944 as American submarine numbers increased and Japanese defensive capabilities deteriorated. Lieutenant Ito Yasushi, a surviving officer from the merchant cruiser Akimaru, described the terror of convoy duty in late 1944. "We sailed knowing that submarines waited along our route. We had 1 escort destroyer for 12 ships. The destroyer could not protect us all. We knew that submarines selected targets based on size and cargo value. We knew that tankers died first, then large cargo vessels, then smaller ships if torpedoes remained. We sailed in darkness, maintaining radio silence, and prayed that other convoys would be attacked instead of ours. There was no honor in this, no glory. Only fear and the understanding that our deaths would come without warning, that the empire we served could not protect us." By early 1945, Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war size. Ships that had survived were increasingly confined to coastal routes between the home islands, unwilling to risk the open ocean where American submarines prowled with near impunity. Critical resources remained stockpiled in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, unable to be transported to Japan. Oil refineries in Sumatra sat idle because there were no tankers to carry crude oil to them. Armies in Burma and the Philippines faced starvation not because food was unavailable, but because the ships that might have supplied them had been sent to the bottom of the Pacific. The 50 ships mentioned in Japanese naval records as sunk by a single submarine, USS Flasher, Tang, or Silversides, depending on the specific engagement being analyzed, represented not just tactical victories, but the culmination of a learning process that had transformed American submarine warfare from ineffective to decisive. Each sinking represented lessons learned from previous patrols, tactics refined through combat experience, and the systematic correction of technical problems that had plagued the submarine force in 1942. The Mark 14 torpedo, once a symbol of bureaucratic failure, became a symbol of institutional flexibility, the willingness to acknowledge mistakes and fix them. This capacity for self-correction distinguished American military culture from Japanese. When American submarine commanders reported torpedo failures, they were initially dismissed, but eventually the system acknowledged the problem and solved it. When Japanese merchant captains reported inadequate convoy protection, they were told to accept the risk as part of their duty to the emperor. When American submarine tactics proved ineffective, the Navy rewrote doctrine and retrained crews. When Japanese anti-submarine tactics failed, the Navy continued using them because changing doctrine would acknowledge that previous approaches had been wrong, an admission incompatible with the face-saving culture that pervaded Japanese military institutions. The result was a war of attrition that Japan could not win. American submarine production accelerated throughout the war. New boats incorporated lessons from combat, improved radar, better air conditioning for tropical operations, enhanced sonar. Crews rotated through training programs that disseminated the tactics of successful commanders. Submarine bases in Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Midway provided repair facilities, rest areas, and logistical support that kept boats operational with minimal downtime. The entire system was designed for sustained operations over years, not months. Japan's submarine force, by contrast, declined throughout the war. Submarines were diverted to supply missions, running food and ammunition to bypassed garrisons in the Central Pacific. High-value fleet submarines were expended in desperate attacks on American carrier groups, achieving minimal results while removing boats from any productive use. By 1945, Japan's submarine force had been reduced to coastal defense and special attack missions, their strategic potential wasted through misuse and attrition. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto would become infamous as the captain of submarine Firestorm 58, which sank the cruiser USS Indianapolis in July 1945, one of the last major submarine attacks of the war. But Hashimoto would also write extensively in his post-war memoirs about the fundamental differences between American and Japanese submarine warfare. He described American submarines as industrial weapons, mass-produced, systematically deployed, part of an integrated campaign that measured success in tonnage sunk rather than prestige targets destroyed. Japanese submarines, he argued, remained samurai weapons, individual tools seeking honorable combat against worthy opponents, fundamentally incompatible with the unglamorous work of commerce warfare. The collapse of Japan's maritime supply network by mid-1945 made the home islands vulnerable in ways that no amount of coastal defense or kamikaze attacks could address. Oil reserves fell to levels that made sustained naval operations impossible. The combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, sat immobilized in port because there was no fuel for training or operations. Aircraft production continued, but pilot training was curtailed because aviation fuel could not be spared. Food imports from occupied territories ceased, forcing Japan to rely entirely on domestic agriculture that could not feed both the military and civilian population. The specter of mass starvation haunted Japanese military planners who understood that the empire faced defeat not through invasion, but through slow strangulation. American submarines had accomplished what strategic bombing, surface fleet engagements, and island campaigns could not. They had severed Japan's connection to the resources that sustained its military power. The defenseless weapons that Japanese naval officers had dismissed in 1942 had evolved into the most effective anti-shipping force in naval history. By war's end, American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 5.3 million tons, approximately 60% of all Japanese merchant losses during the war. They had also sunk 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers, a remarkable toll against warships that were not their primary targets. The tonnage numbers told only part of the story. Each merchant ship represented a link in the supply chain connecting Japan's empire to its industrial heartland. Each tanker sent to the bottom was oil that would never power aircraft or fuel ships. Each cargo vessel was rubber that would never become tires, metals that would never become munitions, food that would never feed soldiers. The systematic destruction of these ships did not produce dramatic battles or heroic last stands. It produced scarcity, hunger, immobility, and the gradual realization that Japan's empire had become a chain of isolated garrisons connected by sea lanes it no longer controlled. On a humid August afternoon in 1945, the submarine USS Spikefish surfaced in the Philippine Sea, her crew gathering on deck to hear the announcement that Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Spikefish had sunk 5 ships during her 4 patrols, contributing her small part to the vast campaign that had destroyed Japan's merchant marine. Her crew understood, in ways that historians would spend decades documenting, that they had participated in something unprecedented, a submarine campaign that had achieved strategic victory not through dramatic fleet actions, but through the patient, systematic application of sea power against an enemy's economic foundation. The Mark 14 torpedo, that symbol of American industrial problem-solving, would be retired after the war, replaced by more advanced weapons, but the lessons it represented would endure. Modern submarines still carry torpedoes descended from those imperfect weapons that had been fixed through institutional flexibility. Modern naval doctrine still emphasizes the importance of sea control through commerce warfare. Modern militaries still study the American submarine campaign as an example of how tactical weapons, properly employed within a comprehensive strategy, can achieve decisive strategic effects. Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto survived the war and dedicated much of his remaining life to analyzing why Japan's submarine force had failed while America's succeeded. His conclusion was stark. Japan had built submarines for the navy it wished to fight, a decisive surface battle between fleets, while America had built submarines for the war it needed to win, a campaign of economic strangulation that cut an island empire off from the resources its military required. Japanese submarines were individually impressive, technologically sophisticated weapons that accomplished little because they were employed in missions that produced no strategic advantage. American submarines were adequate weapons that, produced in overwhelming numbers and employed in a systematic campaign, achieved results far beyond their individual capabilities. The silent hunters of the Pacific Fleet had proven that modern industrial warfare favored not the perfect weapon, but the sufficient weapon produced in quantities that allowed sustained operations. They had demonstrated that tactical flexibility and institutional learning were more valuable than rigid doctrine and face-saving denial of problems. They had shown that unglamorous, patient application of sea power could strangle an empire more effectively than glorious battles or heroic sacrifices. In the end, the Japanese Navy's assessment of American submarines as defenseless proved to be one of history's most catastrophic intelligence failures. A misjudgment born from cultural assumptions about the nature of warfare that collided with the industrial reality of 20th-century conflict. The submarines were never defenseless. They were hunters, and they had learned to hunt with predatory efficiency that Japan's maritime empire could not withstand. By the time Japanese naval planners recognized the threat, the damage was irreversible. The sea lanes were lost. The supply chain was broken. The empire was starving. And beneath those dark Pacific waters, American submarines continued their patrol, their torpedoes ready, their hunting grounds expanding, their mission accomplished through the simple, terrible arithmetic of industrial sea power, sinking ships faster than the enemy could replace them until there were no ships left to sink and no empire left to sustain.